Hello, everyone. Today I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Adam Dorsay, a licensed psychologist and an executive coach in Silicon Valley, where he serves high-achieving adults, including professionals, executives, entrepreneurs, and professional athletes. Dr. Dorsay has clocked over 20,000 hours of practicing psychotherapy with clients, helping them connect to themselves, to each other, and to the world. He's done groundbreaking work with Facebook as a co-creator of its international resiliency program. And now he's come out with a book, Super Psyched, which reveals an innovative framework for readers to create their own connection formula, a customizable tool, if you will, that allows users to strengthen their bonds. Today, we get to discuss this connection formula, the 4 types of connections that Dr. Dorsay is introducing us to in his book, and we get to pick his brain about what connection really is. We mainly focus on couples, of course, given the theme of this podcast, but we also talk about the connection to ourselves, to the world, to our pets, and how in many ways we can start connecting back to our partners by picking the thread from a different place. We could start connecting with our partners after making sure that we are first and foremost connected to ourselves, something which we have talked about on this podcast quite a bit. But we can also start to connect back to our partners and to ourselves by reconnecting to nature, reconnecting to a spiritual realm, connecting to a pet. I have to say that meeting Dr. Dorsay has been incredible. It was very nice to have this conversation with him. When you read his book, you're going to know that his nickname is Enthusiasm, and I think that you are going to get a really good sense of why that is. He's very enthusiastic, and he walks the walk because the first thing that he did was connect with me. We didn't jump into the conversation just to do this podcast. It felt like he was really interested in having a deep discussion about these issues, that he's really interested in giving back and in helping people feel alive. And so I am very happy to be sharing this conversation with you. I've asked a lot of questions that I get from clients and from people who are messaging me privately. So I'm hoping that this will be super valuable to you, and I really hope that you will get in touch with both me and Dr. Dorsay and let us know what you thought about this episode. So without further ado, let's get into this. Hi there. If this is your first time here, welcome to the Parenthood and Relationship Podcast. I'm your host, Markella Kaplani, a psychologist, a parenthood and relationship coach, and a parent myself. Together, we explore the transformative journey of parenthood and its profound impact on our relationship with ourselves, our partners, and our children, so that we can be present and show up as we envision without having to do more. Let's get into today's episode.
Hey, Markella.
Hello, it's so nice to meet you. So, I want to welcome you on the podcast. It's an honor to have you here. And I want to start with giving you a little bit of room to talk about who you are and what you do. I loved that part in your book where you say, I don't talk about myself and say I am a psychologist, and you say I work as a psychologist. And I think that's vital. So I want to give you room to tell us who you are as a person and what it is that you do, which is very, very important work.
Oh, I so appreciate it. So thank you for asking me about me as a human. I am a husband. I am a father. As you might see over my left shoulder, I also have pets in my life. I think there's a sleeping cat over there. I'm working out of my home office today. And I would say I am a curious person. My friend and a person for whom I'm a massive fan, AJ Jacobs, says that he's curious about everything, even things he's not interested in. And I feel the same way. I'm curious about everything, even things I'm not particularly interested in, because it's just that dopaminergic pursuit of knowledge or trying to approximate knowledge, because I don't know that knowledge is ever really attained. But I am constantly seeking, particularly through stories. I think we really relate to stories well, and there's nothing I'd rather hear than stories. I'm obsessed with reading about comedians and their lives. I find them to be, philosophers and groundbreakers and truth tellers. and suffering people, fellow travelers who are often suffering with anxiety and depression. And they find a very good way of leveraging that for something beautiful. So, obsessed with comedy. I am obsessed with travel. If money were no object, I would be probably in Greece multiple times, knowing it very well as many other countries. And those would be probably the biggest things that I quote am. I'm also a Jewish person, not particularly religious, but I really love Maya Angelou's quote that has informed me. You don't know where you're going unless you know where you're from. And I do my best to know where I'm from. I've spent so much time exploring other people's realities, like living in Japan for nearly 3 years and other places and exploring foreign languages. But I've found that it's also crucial to know where I'm from. And I've tried to share that with my sons so that they know where they're from and that they can feel a sense of grounding in that way. And I even devoted a chapter of my book of connecting with your ancestry. It's very important. You've got wonderful ancestry, as we were talking about earlier. I feel a tremendous debt of gratitude to the ancient Greeks who came up with logic and thinking as we know it today in the Western world, and much of the other world has really benefited from it. So that's partially who I am. And my nickname, by the way, as you know, because you read the book, is Enthusiasm. I was born with, I think, an extra dose of zest and enthusiasm for things. People sometimes say, wow, you're so easily impressed. And I say, I'm not so easily impressed. It's just that I have a very high threshold for appreciating things. And I think that's really served me. And I hope to do that till the day I die.
Oh, I think it's something that we're born with. And I think it does take work to upkeep it in a world that sees enthusiasm as maybe naivete or
That's right.
something like that, right? But I do get it, and I think I'm probably not as enthusiastic as you, but I am quite enthusiastic. My son this afternoon said, "I want to learn everything." He's 5, and I want to do everything. So he was wondering about why a friend of his is doing an activity and he can't do it, and I said, "It's just." You're not able to go into chess just yet. They say that you need to be 6. And he was like, but I want to try it all. I want to try everything.
I love
And I
it.
wonder whether somehow, without understanding it, it rubbed off on him or he was just born this way because it felt like, my gosh, this sounds just like me in this moment.
When I'm confronted with that question, is it this or that, that kind of binary, is it nature or nurture? The answer is always, all of the above,
Mm.
to varying degrees, depending on how strong the thing is, obviously. But I love that he's interested in everything, and it sounds like he's just so into living, and that he must be such a joy to have around. My sons are very much that way. My older son is presently walking the Annapurna Trail, hiking the Annapurna Trail in Nepal, and he's just loving life in that way. And my younger son seems to know everything about everything. He just cannot consume enough information. He's just so fascinated, and he often does laps around me in terms of his knowledge on topics. It's just fascinating. So yeah, our children, as you and I both now know, are inspiration and teachers so often.
Yes. And you also mentioned how pets can be teachers. I really like that part of the book. I am taking us in another direction right now
Yeah.
because I really appreciated that chapter. I have recently lost my pet, so it was very touching to read the way that you have posed the connection that we have with our pets. And I want to get into talking about your book, Super Psyched, because I was super psyched to read it. I loved reading it. Every single part that I read, I kept on nodding along. I think at this point, let me check. As I'm saying it, I have 606 highlights. I probably have highlighted the
Wow.
entire book.
Right on. Thank
And
you.
no, thank you. And I wanted to ask you how you decided to write this book and talk about connection, the 4 types of connection.
It's so funny you should ask, because my answer relates to someone you and I were talking about offline, Irv Yalom. Irv Yalom said that every book he ever wrote bit him in the ass. He had no choice but to write it. And this book did that for me. And my apologies for my language, for those who might be sensitive to it, but that's the phrase he uses, and I love it. And I like to say I started 4 books, I finished 1. This was the one that I had to use all of my energy because after about 20,000 hours of being a psychotherapist and hearing the stories and the longings of people, fellow travelers like myself, and reading lots and lots of books and having tons of guests on my podcast, the word connection just kept showing up. It seems to be the precursor to everything we want. Happiness we want, of course, but connection is so important. And the reason I use the word super psyched is not just so that we're super happy. I'm not peddling toxic positivity. I'm talking about being super connected to our psyches. I believe also a Greek term, by the way.
Yes.
Thank you, Greece, for naming that. Whether it's really enjoying an experience and taking it in and savoring it, or really noting that we are in a grief stricken place. Our pets are our teachers. Things go as they're supposed to. We should outlive them. And one of the things they teach us is the ephemeral nature of life. And they teach us about grief in ways that almost no one else can because our pets tend to have no baggage associated with them. I used to run pet loss groups. And
Mm.
when people are super connected to their psyches, they're able to say, oh my gosh, this hurts more than almost any loss I've ever had. And some people may even feel embarrassed by that because, like, they might try to trivialize and say it was only a pet. But as you may see over my left shoulder, I've got a cat. And over my right shoulder, unbeknownst to you, there's a little wooden box that
Oh.
contains the ashes of the cat that caused me to become a pet lover, super connected to my psyche. I'm an extrovert. That cat taught me how to be an introvert. That cat taught me how to take care of someone who was sick. That cat was in my life before I had children and taught me how to take care of another being so that I would be prepared to take care of my children, so that I'd be able to take care of the people I love. An incredible teacher. And I used to hate cats. He taught me that cats are a whole other country from dogs and a whole other culture. And there's so many treasures to be explored with cats that you don't get with dogs. And I love dogs. I mean, I call myself a switch hitter. I'm happy with a dog. I'm happy with a cat. But the reason I wrote that book is because of connection, it being literally the linchpin to everything we want. If you look through the DSM, which is yours and my, diagnostic and statistical manual, which describes all of psychological non-well-being, it describes at length the various depressive disorders, the anxiety disorders, the trauma disorders, the psychotic disorders. If you look at all of them, depression is a disconnection with the present because we're thinking about the past. Oftentimes it's a hallmark. Anxiety, we're future tripping. We're worried about the future, so we disconnected with the present. Trauma can involve dissociation, which is disconnecting with the present in that way, or depersonalization and a whole bunch of other disconnections. And of course, psychosis is disconnection with reality itself. So if disconnection is embedded in everything we don't want, it seems logical, and it's been my take that connection is embedded in everything we do want. Of course, there are moments when we do need to dissociate. When I'm doing a blood draw or taking an injection, I try to go somewhere else. Dissociation is a perfectly adequate short-term coping strategy. But during this dash between our birth date and our death date, how sad it would be to be disconnected the entire time. We want to be connected. And in our relationships, is there a connection? And what is the common denominator? Is it a positive one? And so I explore all of this. And that was something I was willing to dedicate that non-renewable resource called time to. I mean, we can lose our health and get it back. We can lose our money and get it back. We can't lose our time and get it back. I definitely wanted to devote time to exploring the definition of connection and the four ways we connect, as well as possible places we might find it. Because each of us has different formulas relating to connection.
What I really like about the book is that number one, you make it very practical. Number two, you've managed to find a way to create that formula that you're talking about, which makes it more personalized. I can put in my own understanding. But also, number three, and I think this is one of the top reasons that I will be recommending it to a lot of my
Mhm.
clients and already have recommended it to a couple, is because of the fact that you break everything down and you use examples, you use stories, and at the same time, you bring in wisdom from other writers as well. So it's very humble in the sense of you're
Mm.
bringing experts in from your podcast, from books you've read, from all these things, and you give everyone an understanding and a depth, but in very simple terms. You break
Hmm.
everything down and you take it back and you explain it from the beginning to the end.
Thank you for acknowledging that.
Yeah, yeah. I think that all of us need to be reminded of these really important facts. And I was wondering, because this is the parenthood and relationship podcast, so I want to go into relationships in terms of couples. I have been working as a psychologist and therapist myself for several years, and life and work, in the sense of what people seem to be asking for, has taken me to working with parents. And as I started working with parents, because I was very passionate in working with the identity disconnect that was happening after parenthood, I noticed a lot of mothers, they didn't know about matrescence, and fathers don't know about patrescence, the identity shift that we have, and how that really disconnects us from ourselves because we have such a difficult time reconciling the new identity, which we don't recognize as an identity, we think of it as a role, and the old parts of us that need to be reconsidered to create this new normal. But then as I started working on that, partners started bringing their other half into the session. And that's where I started working with couples, and I got myself trained in couples therapy as well, because I saw the need for that connection and how helping the one parent, whether that be the mom or the dad, connect to themselves was much more easily done if I could help them reconnect to each other. And so I want your take on relationships and connection to
It's
each
so
other.
interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's first off, I'm just going to acknowledge one thing. It's some people who have bad relationships and that are suffering. They say, "Oh, what will make it better is if we have a child." And I would say, absolutely not. You have to have a strong foundation to accommodate that child. I've not seen a single case where things got better after having a child, even though it would seem in some ways semi-logical that maybe having a common denominator of some a being that we care for. But so much of our RAM space, if I can use a computerized term, is allocated to caring for the child that we go through a massive, as you describe it, a putrescence or a matrescence. We go through a metamorphosis, and the amount of time that's allocated to caring for this other being who becomes the center of our universe. We barely have time to shower and take care of ourselves, and so oftentimes the couplehood suffers. I've heard many people say, sex is what happens before you have children, and after children, it ceases to exist. And one thing I would absolutely ask of somebody who's considering becoming a parent or who is already a parent is to remain boyfriend and girlfriend with your partner. Keep the romance alive for the sake of the child, if nothing else. But of course, you'll have much more joy in your relationship if you can constantly hit the refresh button by going out on dates, by finding childcare, by being willing to take a moment and say, our relationship matters, even if the intervals are only once every week or 2 weeks or whatever it is. Finding a really high quality, truly reliable babysitter can be one of the most important things a couple does so that they can co-parent well. Being on the same page, having the same values, not disagreeing with each other in front of the children. Super, super important. If you're going to disagree, do it behind closed doors where the kids can't hear you. Presenting as a united front is very, very anxiety reducing for the child. They think, oh, the world is safe. But when they see that there's a split, oh my gosh, their worlds feel very much frayed. So having my children, my wife and I both went into parenthood with that known intention that we will remain boyfriend and girlfriend. And my children haven't once felt any sense of like mommy and daddy are in trouble. We work on the relationship, we devote time to it. It's important. And it would be my wish that couples not refer to each other as mommy and daddy, because when they do that, it becomes a very desexualized, unromantic, kind of icky presentation. Instead, call each other by names or pet names. But you can, when I'm talking about my wife in the absence of her presence, to my sons, I might refer to her as mommy, but I won't. I've never once called her that. My mom is my mom. She gets that one. So yeah, I would strongly recommend investing in the relationship itself. People say they can't find time. They can find time. They find time to be on their smartphones. They find time to be on social media. They find time to watch sports. Uh, Maybe do less of that and do more of just even taking a dog for a walk with your partner is so important while a parent or a nanny or a babysitter is there. Just having a time to reconnect, just going down the street to the local cafe and bringing back that beauty, that romance that we experienced before children. I know that when I was jumped into the gang of becoming a father, it was really terrifying territory because it was an obligation I took very seriously and in many ways doubted that I had the tools to really step up to at the time. And there was no real book out for a father, like, here's what's going to happen to you in your life when you become a father. The only thing that I heard was, oh my gosh, you'll never love anything as much as you love your child. And I thought, well, I want to love my wife at least as much as I love my child differently. It's a different thing. It's like comparing my love for ice cream to comedy, very different things. I love both, but I don't want it to be at the exclusion of my love for my wife. I want to consider all of the parties in my household to be primary. So that would be one of my top connecting tips. Find ways to have meaningful conversations around the table. You probably read about the rosebud and the thorn. When your children become
Yes.
conversant, don't just say, how was your day? They're going to say it was good. But instead, prime them and have these conversations that matter. And the rosebud and thorn is a great way for the parents and the children to connect in a more emotionally focused way. The rose is something that was good that happened today. The bud is something that you learn today. And it's so crucial for children to know that their parents are constantly learning, that even though the parents may have gone to university, that they're still on the quest to learn and that they learn something every day. And the thorn is something that hurts. So if you talk about those three things, the quality of the conversations that will emerge will be vastly better than not using them. Just how was your day is not going to get much data. But the rosebud and thorn is one example of how we can connect in a more authentic way.
Thank you for sharing that. I really did like it. And honestly, I didn't know this technique. I'm going to definitely be using it, both with my clients and at home with my son. As he grows up, I do want him to be sharing more and to give him that opportunity to share with us. And I really like that story that you said about your one client who wanted to reconnect with his children and felt like it couldn't happen, and how you advised him, if I remember, if I recall correctly, to practice it with his wife at the dinner table. And even though his children in the beginning did not want to engage, them seeing each other doing it and making the effort and not giving up led eventually to this, which speaks to patience. And it also speaks to how important it is that we as parents have a good relationship with one another, which will eventually bring in the children, even if there has been a disconnect.
Absolutely. And most of the clients, I put quotes around them, are amalgamations of multiple clients. So this happened with multiple people who said, the rosebud and thorn, it's not working. I said, do it in front of your children, just with your partner, and see how it goes. Without exception, the children wanted to jump in when they saw their parents doing it. I mean, what could be more tantalizing than doing something that we feel semi excluded from? It's using, it's kind of a reverse psychology. What's that?
FOMO, fear of missing out.
It's absolutely FOMO. Yeah. So it's like, oh my gosh, they're doing it and they seem to be loving it. I want in. And so it works. Not heard of a single case in which it hasn't worked.
I'm wondering, I'm thinking of several clients of mine, especially mothers. There's a big prevalence in mom guilt. And so, as you say, and this is something I discuss a lot on my podcast, and I try to give some pointers to make it actionable, but I talk a lot about even 5 minutes or 10 minutes of connection. Even in the house, you don't have to go out, because there's a lot of advice about self-care and about connecting with your partner that is completely unrealistic. And I myself wasn't able to follow. So I try to talk about the importance of connecting, and it doesn't have to be at a restaurant or outside. It can even be in the home. There needs to be the intention. However, I have several times I've had moms, especially, but also fathers sometimes, say that they feel like devoting that time to one another and saying we want to go back to doing some activity we used to do together, which will definitely help us bond. They identify the activity. And then, even though they do have the resources to have their child be with someone that they
Right.
trust, they feel like they are betraying their son, their daughter, their children. They feel like right now we are a unit, we're a family of three or four. Why would I be leaving them behind, is what they're saying. What would you answer to that?
It's a great question. And of course, that feeling of dissonance, of feeling guilt as you leave on this date for the benefit of the couple, it can feel very terrifying, unnatural. It can feel betraying, as you just said. What I would ask people to do is to ask themselves why it might actually be good for them to get away, even though every ounce of their being is saying, I shouldn't do this. There are many things that we know are good for us that we don't want to do because it feels outside our comfort zone. Waking up early for an early morning run or a bike ride, taking an injection that we know we need for our better health, doing an ice bath. I mean, it feels very counterintuitive, but anyone who's done these things, the early morning bike ride or the ice bath in particular, will be able to attest to, assuming there's no medical contraindication doing these things, would be able to attest to the fact that on the other side of doing it is wonderfulness, which is not really a word, but it is unexpected gifts. And of course, you can even talk about it for a moment of like saying, oh my gosh, you know what? I'm feeling the guilt. And the partner can acknowledge, yeah, I feel it too. Or maybe the partner doesn't. But to be real and to lean into connecting with the other and look at the partner as if you were just beginning the relationship. Remember that face that you fell in love with and talk about things other than the children, because if it only becomes children centric, and they are the center of our universes in many ways, but we need a moment. One of the things that we know for sure is that we need to recharge. In the Jewish tradition, we have the Sabbath, and I know that in the Christian tradition as well. And the Sabbath is considered a very holy day because it makes us more whole. It allows us to experience a release from our daily chores, our daily grind. And similarly, we need a moment of Sabbath when we are with our partner away from our child. It is for renewal. It is to say, I renew my vows with you as we venture forth to co parent and to keep the bond between us really solid. And we know that couples who hug and kiss and engage in, not to the degrees of inappropriateness in front of their children, but that they're able to demonstrate a modicum of physical affection. I'm saying, keep it in the rated G realm. You don't want to make your kids traumatized by seeing like how into each other you are. But at the same time, it can, I believe, foster a greater sense of, again, safety and recognizing, wow, mom and dad are good. I guess we are good too. And the dating will contribute to that reality.
Yeah, the time that we take for one another. And you're right. It's important for our children to be able to also see that and to feel that safety. And so reminding ourselves how important it is for the children and to be able to bring this forward and honestly discuss it and to do it anyway, to do it scared, to do it despite the fact that it might be uncomfortable. Like you said, it's outside our comfort zone at the moment. We used to love it and it should feel fine. It doesn't feel fine, but we can do this together, knowing that it might be harder for me than it is for you, but acknowledging that we're doing it for each other and for the greater good of the entire family.
Absolutely. You said it so beautifully, and I could not begin to agree more. And, Susan Jeffers wrote a book called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. And that's a beautiful formula. Feel the guilt and do it anyway. Feel the blank and do it anyway. You and I both went to college and graduate school. Did we really want to write those papers? No, we had to feel the feels that we had and write the paper anyway. So it's a nice linguistic algorithm of feel the blank and do the thing anyway.
So I'm taking you somewhere else right now.
Mhm.
I don't think we've broken down for our listeners the four ways of connecting. So I would like for you to tell us a little bit about these four different ways of connecting, these types of connection, and whether if I am feeling disconnected from myself and my partner and potentially feeling that I might not necessarily be very connected to the world, my children, whether I can start the process of reconnecting through just tapping in at one of the ways initially
That
has a snowball effect of some sort.
100%, and it does have a snowball effect. One of the things that I took great interest in as I was writing the book and considering what I wanted the reader to experience was the fact that we don't just connect in one way. And in fact, we all connect in at least four ways that I was able to identify. There might be more, but I haven't found anything beyond the fourth. But if you can imagine four concentric circles and a ripple out, and at the very center would be ourself. We need to connect with ourselves. We need to know who we are, what's true. Now, you probably became a mother because on some level you knew that you wanted to become a mother, and that was your truth. That was going to be part of your dash between your birth date and your death date. You needed to do this. But if you were not true to yourself and you became a parent and didn't want to become a parent, that would be untrue. So we need to connect with who we are and what we're about. And really, we know that authenticity leads to greater strength, period. If without it, it's as if we're walking through life with rocks in our shoes. I like this kind of real visceral metaphor. Let's imagine that you and I were attending a lecture. It was a long lecture. And I had to go pee really badly during that lecture, and I barely made it through. And I'm running to the door of the bathroom. And let's say finally we meet, and you say, Adam. And I'm like, Markella, am I really available to connect? Of course not. And we wouldn't think twice about that. I know it may sound like a contradiction. Well, you feel guilt when you go out on a date, and how can you do that? Well, feelings are not facts. And don't believe everything you feel. But of course, if you got to go pee, that's a different thing. But that's very true. Oftentimes you'll see people who are not interested in the opposite sex, marrying the opposite sex because they come from families that are very restrictive and they don't want to let down their parents. And do they have good marriages? Are they living their lives? And we know that they are not. And I'm so grateful that, various types of marriage are emerging. And same-sex marriage is a really important advance, I believe. Anyway, we connect with ourselves. We connect with others. Connecting with others could include everything from me connecting with my wife to connecting with my children to connecting with you, any other. And of course, that is informed by how well I'm connected to myself at its nucleus. And then the third area that we connect is with the world. That could include our work. That could include art. That could include nature. That could include our ancestry, among other things. And a fourth realm is something greater. Now, for some people who might be religious in nature, that might mean going to church or their place of worship. For the most orthodox atheist, even they would go to the Greek ruins and feel a sense of awe, like they've been around since before Christ, before the Common Era. That's amazing. They might say, wow. Now, when we say wow, it's a sign that we are experiencing awe, A-W-E. And what the research on awe indicates that it's so good for our health. It's almost like gratitude on steroids. And that's a spiritual experience, no matter how we define it. It's something bigger than we are. When we see something like the Grand Canyon, or if you go to any place in Iceland, I imagine, you're going to be saying wow all the time because it's amazing and bigger than us. And I would even go so far as saying, speaking with you, Markella, is bigger than me. This is in many ways a spiritual experience. Martin Buber talks about the I and thou. You and I are speaking to each other with respect and kindness, and we are treating each other like spiritual beings, even if we don't necessarily believe in God. There's something bigger happening right here in the field between us. You're all the way in Greece. I'm sitting here in the middle of Silicon Valley, and yet something is happening that is bigger than either of us alone. And so that book, it's made to help people find their sense of connection. By the way, I define connection. It's a working definition, but it's something that brings in vitality, causes a sense of aliveness. It's life force, and you know it when you feel it. Perhaps a piece of music hit you just like, oh my gosh, I feel changed and I feel so alive. Or perhaps an activity or a connection with a person, or perhaps, as you were describing, your connection with Irv Yalom and his writings. You and I both were reading him on beaches, and people were probably looking at us kind of like, what are you doing? That's not beach material. But for us, we were connecting with one of the great minds who's ever lived. So connection is whatever it takes for us to feel life force, a sense of vitality.
Ah, I love that. And yes, I got several comments on reading Yalama on the beach, but
Oh my God.
it's one of the best reads that I've had. It's calming, and that's connection to nature. For me, I'm lucky enough to be living in Greece, and so I can access the beach very easily from wherever that I'm at. I'm sorry, I'm rubbing it in your face.
That's incredible. That doesn't seem
And
real.
oh yeah, the thing that I do when I get very stressed out or overwhelmed or emotional is that I don't live that close to the beach, but walking distance is about 45 minutes,
Oh
and
my
I make that walk, and I have a book with me, and I sit by the rocks, and I hear the water splashing, and after I've calmed down, I read a little, and I then walk back, and that's the way that I reconnect to myself, to nature. It's nice to have.
so great. And that's part of your connection formula. And just wow is all I can say. Living 45 minutes from the Greek Ocean, I mean, like, I can't even. So there's the Mediterranean right there. And it's inconceivable to me, like, to have that access. But we don't need to have that luxury, which is immense. It could be just connecting with cooking in our house and
Yes.
really savoring the experience of the smells around us. Awe and a sense of connection can happen with seemingly everyday experiences. What we appreciate appreciates. And I know that if I look at my wife, we just celebrated our 22nd anniversary, I can look at her and just habituate and just say, oh, she's just here, whatever. I've seen her a million times. Or I could look at her and see her for the miracle she is. Oh my gosh, this incredible spiritual being walked into my path and has said she wants to be with me. That is a miracle. And that we met, and that we're so well matched. I find that appreciating her on the regular means that our relationship will never be old.
Right. And the fact that you're able to be grateful for the luck that you have to be with this partner, but this is a conscious process, and you talk about that as well
100%.
in the book, right? You need to consciously make sure that you're working on this, and you need to consciously, I think a lot of us expect that if it's true, is what we say to ourselves. If it's true, then it should be happening on its own. I shouldn't
That's
have
right.
to consciously think about appreciating you. If you were worthy of my appreciation, it would probably just come naturally. We don't understand that no, love also is a process, and gratitude and appreciation also needs us to work on it and to find reasons why we fell in love with one another, find the reasons why, remind ourselves of all these things, because we can get lost in the routine and in the expectations, and that can grow into resentment. And the resentment is easy to happen, and we're consciously thinking of all the things we don't like about our partner, but then we expect to not consciously just have the love reappear. And
Yes.
that's unrealistic.
It's supposed to, yeah. I mean, I love the way you're phrasing it. It's supposed to be as natural as a leaf falling from a tree. And you and I both know that Eric Fromm got it right when he said that love is a practice. And I quoted him in my book. It's my favorite quote, I think, ever on love, but that it is a discipline in many ways. And it doesn't mean that it's not real. Esther Perel reminds us that it was very easy for those who were in college or who were unencumbered with jobs and children to have great romances and sex. And that one of the things I talk about in my book is it's really important to have sex dates and to actually, and it sounds really unrealistic. You might have been changing diapers or doing something super unsexy, talking to your mother-in-law or something like that. But there's a set time. You get in the room, the first 5 minutes feel totally like, what? This is not natural. This is not the way it was before we got married and everything else. And then around minute six is the way Esther Perel describes it. And it's been true for everyone I've talked to who engages in this practice of making, sex dates, is that around minute six, you begin to realize, oh wait, this is great. This is not as natural as it is in the movies. By the way, in the movies, they do us such a deaf service. You only see the young, unencumbered love and the hot sex between them. You never see somebody who's been married for 15 years rocking it and feeling profoundly romantic. The first time I ever saw anything in that realm was in the TV show This Is Us, where you see the husband and wife, they are into each other. And I was like, thank you. That is about time we see this. And at the end of the reunion of these two souls engaging sexually, I have not heard of anybody looking at the other and saying that was a bad idea. They on the other side of it, it's like, oh yeah, I did, 0% of me felt like it when we entered the room, but boy, am I glad we found a way back to each other in this way. It's so crucial, and we know that the hormones that are released through any form of really good touching include oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine, these things that have fairly long half-lives. And when couples are willing to plow past the resistance, assuming there's no sexual trauma or other thing interfering. Like, I'm not talking about, the presence of an affair and something that hasn't been worked out or something like that. But I'm talking about just for folks who don't have those types of obstacles, that they find a way back to each other. It's so important for the couple. And it trickles down. It's obviously outside the audible area of the children, but it's so important that couples keep that part alive.
I think at some point, as I was reading that part, I was like, "Oh, scheduled time for sex, okay." And it got me a little bit intrigued because it's not necessarily something that I have suggested. I've talked about scheduled time for other things, and it was really refreshing to hear and to read that take that there's an answer to that as well. Because I do get that question quite a bit from couples that if we have to really try, doesn't that just mean that the love is gone? If we have to try so hard, shouldn't love be easy? Is the expectation? And the answer is no, no, it's not. But what I really love doing with couples, and I tend to do it at the first few sessions, if not the first session, is that I ask them what it is that made them fall in love, how they met, because they come in and they just want to tell you their problems, and the problem is their partner. And so they're just telling me what their partner is doing wrong and how they're upset with their partner. And then I stop them in their tracks and I ask them, okay, but what did you fall in love with? And more often than not, you'll see these big smiles. All
Mm.
of the sudden, you can see them smiling and looking at each other instantaneously with a very different set of eyes, with that glimmer. And so that snap in time where you ask them to just switch their thinking and think about what it is that made them fall in love, even though they think it's gone now, just remembering it creates such a difference for them. And it helps them reconnect to that part that they fell in love with. But then we don't realize that you can tap into that at any point in time. You can keep on reminding yourself all these things, and you will start to see things in the now daily, things that make you still be in love.
Absolutely. We humans, as I mentioned before, we habituate, we get used to a thing. The car that we were so excited about when we bought it, it's just become same old, same old. The house that we couldn't believe that we could afford, that we got to move into. Well, somebody else has a better house, so we engage in social comparison. There's so many distractors, and it's a discipline. Connection is not just something that sometimes it just happens. Like the first time you hear for me, Bohemian Rhapsody. So like, okay, what was that? For me anyway, that was like a moment. Or reading Carlos Ruiz Zafón, The Shadow of the Wind. Like I knew, like I didn't need anything. It was totally natural. But as you were saying, just it's appreciating that person and dialing back to that original question. I believe it was Virginia Satir who was one of the kind of pioneers in asking that question to couples. You're nodding. What caused you to fall in love? And I want to hit that refresh button all the time. I'm going to repeat it. What we appreciate appreciates. And that is the way of doing it. It may feel vulnerable to express an appreciation, but what we know for sure thanks to the hard work of John Gottman, is that there is a golden ratio of positive to negative to be in a net positive place with your partner, that we need to emit five positives for every negative. And most of us have that sadly in reverse. And again, it's a discipline. It's noticing the good. Positive psychology has taught us that due to the negativity bias, we're far more easy, it's far easier to access the negative. And yet, if we are willing to override that, kind of to use an old computer term, to hit Control Alt Delete, to override the system defaults and say, hey, I am going to consciously look for the positive and I'm going to name it as I see it. That's far more likely to get us into that 5-to-1 positive to negative ratio, which we need. And some even express that for children, they need to be in a 10-to-1, particularly if they are non neurotypical. So just by doing this, it will solve more problems than we create by a long shot by naming what's good.
Definitely, if you start to count how many negative interactions you might be having with your partner, and then you multiply that by 5 or 6 or 7, you realize that there's a lot of repairing to do, and
So much.
that takes effort, but it's really worthwhile, and it is doable. Because it may sound like, oh my God, like I can't repair that. If we kind of think about all the ways that we have hurt each other, how can we make it better? But it's possible. You can reconnect way easier with someone that you once felt the connection.
100%. We see these beautiful people on the screen and we imagine, oh my gosh, if I was only with them, it would be great. And we all know, who've sat with couples, no one is a free lunch. There is nobody who is that ideal. Everybody's imperfect. And everyone in relationship will hurt the other person by virtue of the fact that we're not carbon copies. And we wouldn't want to be with a carbon copy. There would be nothing dynamic there. But the repair, being able to repair quickly, is one of the most important things for couples to learn. And it's a lot easier said than done. But one of the things we know also is that hugging for 40 seconds, Stan Tatkin, to whom I owe a huge debt of gratitude, and I think the world of psychology does, particularly in couples work, he's really looked at the human brain and figured out what helps us reconnect when we are disconnected, and belly to belly hugging, even just pulling up your shirt a little bit when you're hugging your spouse and saying, I want to feel your belly, because there's so many neural pathways, neuron endings in our bellies. It sounds funny. And hugging for 40 seconds can feel long. By the way, I would not recommend doing that in front of your children. That would be a little weird. But hugging for 40 seconds, not necessarily with belly exposed, is a very good way to repair. And then, of course, there are certain tactical tools, which we don't have the time to get into, but Harville Hendricks came up with imago therapy, which is where one person is the sharer and the other person is the listener. And the listener cannot make any comments or editorialize. The listener has to listen, and the teller doesn't get to attack the other person. They must use I statements like, this is how I felt when this happened. When this happened, I felt that, is kind of one of the ways of emitting a message. But there's so many ways to reconnect. And one of the things that I feel grateful to Michelle Obama for writing in her book is, here she is, the most powerful couple in the world for 8 years. They engaged in couple therapy. So if they can do it, we can do it. And I would recommend that to all couples, to at least engage in some form of couple therapy to learn the tools, not because there's a problem in the relationship, but so that each member of the couple can have something akin to gloves, mask, and a smock, almost like you're in a chemistry lab handling combustible elements. Some of these relationship conversations are fairly combustible. And so you need personal protective equipment like the gloves, the smock, and the goggles so that you can handle those conversations in a more skillful way.
Yes, yes. And even though in places like the US, therapy for a long while has been something that is destigmatized, right? Because,
Right.
right? But for
But it used to
couples,
be very stigmatized, but yes.
yes, same here. But for couples, what I'm noticing and what the Gottmans were saying is that there is, I don't remember, I'm not as good as you remembering all the things by heart, but what they were saying was this dire statistic of how most couples, which was something that I have noticed myself, are going to go into couples therapy as the very last resort. And it
Got it.
seems like most people consider couples therapy as in itself being an admission of failure. That if I have to go to couples therapy, it's an admission of failure. So it's very refreshing to see certain people who choose to go into couples therapy or parent coaching when they become parents without necessarily having run into a problem, quote unquote, or an issue, but because they want to be in a state where they're picking up the tools, but also they have someone when things start to get a little bit fuzzy to put them back in place to help them recover and repair in a safe space without having to leave things be till the last resort. And then we wonder, why did couples therapy end up in a split anyway?
You nailed it. I mean, think of it as the place where you work out. You're building muscles as a couple so that the two of you will be stronger. And the tools that are available now that were not available 30 years ago, they've become so sophisticated. There are different styles and different flavors for every couple, and some tools will work for one couple and won't work for another couple. It's not a one size fits all proposition, but finding out what those tools are and taking time to step away. One of my favorite storytellers describes a boy who doesn't know which way to go. And his brothers were in front of him. They were all three on horses, and the first two just ran off the cliff. And the boy gets off his horse and comes in contact with a dwarf who tells him where to go. We need to stop. We need to get off our horses. We need to not assume that we have to know everything. We need to humble ourselves and ask for directions from time to time, which is something that many of us don't want to do because we feel that we'll look stupid. But the fact of the matter is, we actually engage stupidly without having the wisdom that's out there. And the wisdom is definitely out there.
Yes. I completely agree. And therapists go to their own therapy, and couples therapists will go to couples therapy. And this is because when we're too close to something, we cannot see it exactly the same way that someone else can help us, guide us toward certain answers. I want to wrap this conversation up by going back to the self and reconnecting with the self. And a lingering question in sessions that I've come across is, how do I know what I want? So you mentioned authenticity before, and that could be a whole new conversation for another time about authenticity, because I think that in our times, a lot of times when we say that we're being authentic and I'm just being myself, it's really just a reaction. It's something different than authenticity. But what I want to talk about today, because you're an expert in connection, is, how do I know if I'm connected to myself? There are a lot of people that feel like the decisions they're making. So, something that you said before, some people will have a child, but did they really want the child? Or was it that I had to prove something to society? Was it that I had to please my parents and continue the family name? Was it that I have just been told that that is my purpose in the world? And this is something that people have come to me either before deciding or after having gone through with certain decisions in their lives, even that being their partner. Did I marry him or her because I had to be married, because the clock was ticking, because my parents loved him or her, or did I want to? And so, what I notice a lot of times is that the foundation, which is the connection to ourselves, is faulty. And even people who are thinking and they want to know, they can't find the answer. Was it really me that made this decision, or was it something else?
I mean, your questions are almost rhetorical questions because they're the answers as well, what you just said. So often I will work with a guy in his 40s or 50s who did all the right things, went to the right school, got the right internships, got the right job, married the so-called correct person, except he's realizing as he's walking through life, oh my gosh, I was doing this to please other people. None of this was about me. I work with these really, really strong, highly successful, primarily men in Silicon Valley, and they've been great teachers to me. My father's a physician. And the question I got all my life was, are you going to follow in his footsteps? And I remember when I was studying in high school chemistry and biology, I realized there was no way I could follow in his footsteps, even though deep down wanted to, because that seemed like the best way to honor my father. What he had the wisdom to know is that the best way to honor him was for me to find my truth. And my father's been very clear about this all along. He's never once said, I'm a physician, therefore you should be one too. And I feel like the great beneficiary of a very wise and kind father who would be willing to say such things. What we know is that it's like electricity connection. You know it when you feel it. I'm guessing that when you decided on psychology, now it wasn't by no means your only path. I'm guessing there could be as many as 30 paths you could have taken that would have had something authentic within it. But you found one that brings you alive. And there's no question because you've passed the beach test. You read it on the beach. You would not read it on the beach if it wasn't really there. You're having a love affair with psychology because there's a vitality to it. And we can try to convince ourselves that we love something. Could be music, could be a piece of art that everybody told us that we should love, except for the fact that we feel nothing. And yet we try to fake it and pretend that we do. So it's our job in this life to take a moment, step off our horses and ask ourselves, do I feel a vitality here? Does this bring me alive? And in some cases, we're put in hard circumstances. Some cases, we're working at jobs that actually we have no other options but to do them. Martin Seligman talks about a single mom who was educated, but due to her financial situation in childcare, was relegated to being a food server. She hated being a food server, and there was no connection there. But she took something called the Values in Action Inventory. It's viacharacter.org. You can take it for free. It's a 10-minute forced choice questionnaire. And it can be a little painful to take just because the questions are so hard to answer in some ways. But the data it reveals is really non-ambiguous and excellent and validated. You will find out what your top strengths are, your top values. And what she found when she did it was that she really had a strength of interpersonal connection, but she wasn't really using it while she was on her shifts. She was just feeling a profound sense of resentment that she was doing it at all. So she leaned into it. She got interested in her customers. She got interested in her coworkers. And what felt like her 4-hour shifts felt very long initially before she did this. And because she was in flow, this idea of being immersed, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi talks about. When she was in this state of flow, her shifts felt like way shorter than they actually were. Her tips went up. She loved her coworkers and her customers, became regulars. And anyway, we can all do this by asking ourselves, what is an element to this experience that I can tap into authentically? Like when I go see the opera with my father's an opera fan. I appreciate the opera more intellectually, but I can always find elements to the opera that I appreciate. I could not do a 6-hour Wagnerian opera with him. I would think that would be a very expensive place to sleep. But I can do, a 2 to 3 hour typical opera. And I can find something that moves me deeply, even though it's not something I would choose to go to on my own. So can you find an element, a detail, a part that if you are in a situation that might not interest you, can you find something there? And can you make sure that you find other things that bring you alive? It might be an activity, and it might be an activity that you find a little bit embarrassing to admit that you love doing. I say in my book, there is no such thing as a guilty pleasure, as long as you're not hurting anybody. It's just pleasure. I remember in high school, I absolutely loved a man of Greek descent. His name was George Michael in England, although he had a much longer name in his Greek name. And straight boys anyway, were not allowed to like George Michael or Wham. It was relegated to girls primarily because it was teeny bopper music. But the fact is he has a voice of an angel and he moves me, and I couldn't fake that. He brought me alive, but I usually had to listen to him behind closed doors or with the windows rolled up. But the fact of the matter is the man was awesome. And there was no question that he brought through life force for me. 100% full body yes. I now can listen to him with my windows rolled down, and I'm out as a serious George Michael fan. I remember I saw him in concert when he came to town, and I was by myself, and the only other men who were there were either gay or there with their girlfriends. But I was there because I wanted to be there. So we all need to find that thing, even if we feel self conscious about it, even if people say that's stupid or they eye roll or they shame you, and maybe spend less time with those folks if they don't get it, if they're not willing to at least try to enter your world.
Yeah, it's really important, but there's also, psychology of the masses and how people view us and how we really want to connect with the tribe. And so it takes a
Hmm.
lot of effort to be able to say, I like it anyway. And if you don't like it, I'll find my own people, my own tribe. But it is worth it, right?
100%. And even though my wife is my primary member of my tribe, our overlap has certain areas where we are not confluent. Like she will not watch Lord of the Rings with me. She will not watch professional basketball with me. And I wouldn't want her to watch either of those things because she would hate either of them. But my sons will watch either of them with me and cheer at least as loud. I'm obsessed with the Golden State Warriors. My wife has no interest. She's obsessed with bluegrass music, and she'll go to an all-day festival. I've come to appreciate some group bluegrass music, but I'm not a huge fan. So we can't expect that our partners to be into everything we're into. And we may have other tribes for that. Esther Perel talks about the fact that we used to live in these villages where we had different people for different functions, and now we tend to lean on our spouse to solve all of those functions. Not going to happen.
Yeah.
Impossible. And it's too much stress on the marriage. We need other people to dissipate that energy. So if I want to hang out with my boys and make a lot of noise, my boys being my male friends, that's just not the way she will engage with me. And I can't expect her to do so. And she can't expect me to do the things that she might do with other tribes with whom she hangs.
Exactly. Yes. You mentioned friendships, and I really like the take you have on it, that it's really important that we also maintain that. And it's something that I haven't talked about a lot. It kind of sparked a different take that I haven't had on my podcast and I haven't talked about because, yes, friends are really important and we need to be able to lean on other people. And not just friends, but also our sisters or cousins, that village. We need to be
100%.
able to lean on them. But I've even heard for people saying this about friends that if my friend A doesn't cover all of my needs, if I can't trust her to talk about very deep stuff, but we can only hang out together, go dancing together, then she's not really a friend. And I like the way that you break it down and you say, no, but based on what Esther Perel says and what I've seen in my practice, yes, you could have different friends for different things, different tribes for different things. And that is totally okay. And it can fill your cup just as much.
You nailed it. And I like thinking of different friends as being different types of superheroes. That person that you go out dancing with might not be able to have a deep conversation, but the two of you have a deep conversation in dance, but not verbally. So we have different superheroes. I have a friend who, will show up to solve problems, but would not be somebody I would lean on for emotional support necessarily. He's more for tactical things. And that's awesome. I love that. And I can do that for him too. And in some ways, I can attend a little bit more to his emotions than he could to me, for example. But I don't expect him to be into talking about deep emotional stuff. That's not his jam. And yeah, so it's really important to recognize the superhero strengths of our friends and not to expect them to do other things. Now, I'm not talking about a friend who engages in some type of betrayal. That is not okay. That's possibly and likely grounds for a dissolution of the friendship. Since friendship is the ultimate democratic relationship, you can opt in or opt out at any time. But it's really important that after an engagement with our friend, with whatever it is, that we somehow feel taller, that we somehow feel more energized. I call it the drive-away test. When we drive away from an interaction, do you feel more alive than you did? If not, like for example, if the friend is constantly just bringing it back to themselves, or that they are non-champions and they roll their eyes at everything you say and don't champion you to go do something bold. I'm not talking about reckless, but appropriately bold, like pursuing a degree later in life or whatever it might be. That's not awesome. If the friendship is literally just about dancing and there's no betrayal, you've got a superhero dancing friend, and that's your dancing friend.
That's great. So, to wrap things up, because you've given us a lot of your precious time, I want you to share with us what it is that you hope that your readers will take away from your book.
Well, first of all, Markella, before I even answer that question, I want to tell you you're brilliant, and it's been a blast being with you. So I feel like I gave none of my time. I feel like I got time. But secondly, what I'm hoping for is the opposite of a limp handshake. I don't know if you've ever yeah, you know what I'm talking about. It's like
Yes.
gross. I don't want people to have a limp handshake in life. I want them to have a vital handshake in life where they're able to say, hello, Markella, nice to meet you. And you feel like, oh, there's a person on the other side of that hand. I want people to be alive while they are living. I think it was Benjamin Franklin who said, die at 25, but are buried at 75. So they so to speak, they have two deaths. They have a spiritual death at a particular age, and then they physically die much, much later. I want people to be alive while they're living. And oftentimes it means confronting an inconvenient truth, doing things that may be scary or uncomfortable, but I want them to feel alive. I want them to be more authentic and ultimately more connected to themselves, and definitely more connected to others in their lives who they deem precious. So that's my biggest hope in this book, is more vitality.
I hope that a lot of people read your book, not for you, but for them. I think
Thank
it's
you.
going to serve them very, very well. I believe it's brilliant. It's a
Mm.
very nice way for people to slowly start to get back to themselves, to each other, and reconnect to the world and their dreams and all the things that give them life, like you said. So I think if you haven't heard of the book and if you haven't read it, it's called Super Psyched and you need to go get it. I'll have all the links down below. If there's
Uh,
anything that you want to share, you can tell us now, but I'll definitely link everything in the description wherever anyone's listening.
well, thank you so much. Well, people can find me at my website, dradamdorsay.com, DRADAMDORSAY.com. It provides links to everything I do, and including to connecting with me. Got a couple TEDx talks, one on men and emotions, and one on friendship and adulthood, which is another really dear topic to me. And of course, I've got my own podcast called Super Psyched, one word as opposed to the two words on the cover of the book. And I just interview all types of people who bring to me a sense of vitality. So the criterion is they have to get me super psyched. And the common topics in psychology, but sometimes it goes way beyond that. Like I did one with a ramen chef in Tokyo. I did on ice cream, and some people might say, "Wait, what's that?" And they are very, very, very well loved. So yeah, that's pretty much what I do and how people can find me. And I'd be honored to know that people are loving the book and what it might do for them. So feel free to reach out to me if you read it and want to tell me what it meant to you.
Great. Thank you so, so much for dedicating your time. I know you said that you felt that you gained time. I felt the same way. It was wonderful to have you here. Thank you for sharing all this knowledge and all this depth and all this emotion as well. It's very appreciated. And maybe, hopefully, you'll be back on at some point on the podcast to discuss other topics further that we didn't get to touch upon today.
That would be awesome. I'd be so down to meet. Oh, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention I do keynote speeches and talks all the time. So if people want that, I'm available in person or virtually. But yeah, Markella, I hope we have another one of these. It was so much fun. You're so thoughtful, and you didn't just read the book, as you mentioned. You had 606 highlights, but you really seem to read it with depth. And I hope that people can do that for anything that they love, just really get into whatever they're into. So I think you really serve as a good model for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Again, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
Well, wasn't this wonderful? So, in closing this episode, I want to leave you with a reflection that ties into the heart of this conversation: connection. Whether it's connection to yourself, your partner, your children, or even the world around you, nurturing this sense of connection is not just about achieving happiness. It's about cultivating a profound sense of vitality and presence in your life. Dr. Dorsay reminded us today that connection is a practice, not a given. It's the small moments, looking at your partner with fresh eyes, engaging in meaningful conversations, or simply appreciating the miracle of the relationships that we have. Connection takes effort, and sometimes it feels uncomfortable or counterintuitive, but it is always worth it. On this podcast, we often talk about the chaos of parenthood and how it can shake the foundations of our relationships, both with ourselves and with others. But as Dr. Dorsay shared, the tools for reconnection are within our reach. Whether it's taking a moment to reconnect with your own truth, hugging your partner for those transformative 40 seconds, or scheduling time to rekindle intimacy, these small acts have a ripple effect that can transform not just our relationship, I would say, but the entire family dynamic. I encourage you, therefore, to take this one thing from today's episode, just one, and apply it in your life. Maybe it's the rosebud and thorn exercise at the dinner table, or perhaps it's reflecting on what first made you fall in love with your partner. Whatever it is, lean into it and watch how it begins to spark something new. Finally, don't forget that connection starts with you. As we heard today, the journey inward is what makes all other connections possible. So take a walk, reflect on your values, or simply ask yourself what makes you feel alive. Thank you for joining me on this incredible episode. If something resonated with you today, I'd love to hear from you. Reach out to me and let me know how this conversation impacted you. Until next time, remember, connection is the foundation of it all. Start here and everything else will follow. You're doing an amazing job. See you next Sunday.